Real quick, before we get into the last two images that you're going to work on, I just want to show you another image that I just worked up. And I was going to put it in these videos, but I think it's going to make them too long. And it's just sort of a combination of some of the things we've already looked at, particularly color grading and lighting. So there's a photo in here. Yes, close-up photo of a woman wearing a red sweater. You do not have to open this or try to do this. I want to go through it very quickly and just explain to you the things that I did and show you how many times you can change this just by doing the same things we've done a bunch of times already. So I obviously made my background copy here, and I'm going to go through these layers and tell you what they are. So the first one is a gradient map, just like we've done already. And so if you click on that, I've got the gradient map in here, and I used a layer mask to leave her eyes out of that. So you can see the map here, some really strong blue and magenta. So that made a significant change to the overall tone of the image. And then I used the mask itself to let her eye color come through. So we've got those two little holes there to kind of let those go through. The next one is a curves adjustment layer, and I'm going to go into a little bit more detail of that after I run through these layers because we haven't really talked about it yet. It's one of the most, um, it's one of the, for lack of a better word, most powerful editing tools in Photoshop. It's also the one that gets people super confused. It still confuses me to this day sometimes, but I want to show you quickly kind of what it does after I go through these. So this curves adjustment layer changed all of the color tones in here, and it can also break it down into the actual color channel, so RGB for this image. So I click that, and you can see this gives a totally, again, different feel for this image. And if you look at the mask here, I don't have it open to the color of her eyes, so it's still affecting what we've done down here. So that's pretty much three completely different looks. Our original image, our gradient map, and then the curves adjustment layer all give a significantly different tone to the image. So the next one here is essentially just a color fill. So it's an adjustment layer that is just a solid color. I'll click on this one now. And so you can see it is a color mode. Just real quick, gradient map, obviously we use soft light. We've talked about that already. The color fill layer, just this magenta color, is on an overlay. So that's used to essentially change the lighting of this image to sort of imagine that there's lighting coming in from the side, and that lighting is tinged magenta. And so I use that overlay. So if I were to use this on normal, you can kind of see what it looks like there. How that light is essentially painted in. And what I did was just added that solid color layer and then went into this mask and used that mask and uses of changing the flow on my brush so that I could get different levels of transparency here to sort of emulate that light coming in. And so again, the flow on a brush, I think we've talked about it in class, it is the digital equivalent of like paint. So if you had a brush that had 100% flow, it means that you constantly have the full amount of paint that you could conceivably have coming through your brush. So in the digital brush, it's basically you're getting 100% opacity and color every time you use it. When you turn the flow down, and it really doesn't make a huge difference visually unless you're using pressure sensitivity until you get down to like 10%. And so you're essentially using 10% of the amount of paint that you could conceivably use on that brush. And I'm making air quotes for the word paint, so that you would have to go over an area 10 times to get back up to 100. And it is additive, so you can keep going over the same spot, and it gets for lack of a better word, air quotes, thicker every time you do it. So flow is very important. You can also use grayscale in your black and white on your masks, but it's a lot easier to me to use something like flow. So I'm going to turn this mask off again, just show you what it looked like beforehand. So we have the entire um, image covered in that magenta with an overlay. By using the mask, we can simulate that this is light coming in from the left, kind of the left front, and so these areas back here are hidden from the light by her face and her other side of her arm, so they don't get affected with that light. And so the last couple of things that I've put up here, this layer is essentially I painted in some cyan areas over here. I wanted to play around with that to simulate light, and I changed that blending mode around until I got some colors that were working for me. Which these lean much more towards red. And so I painted that in. I'll very quickly kind of show you probably about what it looked like. I kind of followed the existing highlights that were already here very quickly, kind of like this, except it took a little more time than that. And then I used blur tools to blur them out and cast them across the image. So I used motion blur. And then I enlarged that image so that these sort of beams of light were coming in from the entire frame as opposed to just here, because my original concept wasn't really working for me. And then using this divide mode gave me the levels of transparency and stuff that I was looking for, but it altered the color. So I applied a hue saturation adjustment layer to just this because it's clipped. And you can see here that I've reinforced that idea of those magenta colors that I've got down here. So we've got, like, again, three very different complete photo looks with just those layers. So you can do a lot with those. So I'm going to turn off these up here just so I can get back down to this curves layer and kind of show you what it does. So again, this is what it looks like without the curves. I'm going to turn it back on and click on curves and show you this little box here. So curves, again, really, really can get out of hand very quickly if you're not careful with what you're doing. So curves gives you this, basically this diagonal that goes from the darkest points of the image to the lightest points of your image. So down here's your dark, up here's your light. You can see I've already made some changes here. So it comes in, the first layer is like the master layer. It's RGB. It's every layer of color in here. So here's my red layer. You can see I've made some changes. Green layer, you can see I made some changes. And blue layer, you can see I made some changes. So I've done something to all of these. The way that works, again, is you move this diagonal by placing anchor points on it and shifting them up and down the line, moving them vertically, and it starts to get out of hand when you try to use too many anchor points because the entire thing can kind of bow and get out of control. So for example, if I were to put a point here and move it, it only affects things on the left side of it. If I put points between, you can see that it starts to bow up on the other side. So it's affected by the things that I do on each end of it. So you don't want to get too out of control with those anchor points. One of the easiest ways to kind of get a point on your diagonal here in your curve is you can use the dropper tool to find the spot. So like if I come over here and, oh, it's got the wrong one. If you come over here, you can use the dropper tool to pick an actual area, or you can use the little scrubber here, and you can come over here and you can see where it jumps around. If you're looking at the curve when I move this dropper around, it shows you on the curve where you are. So darker areas are going to be much further down towards the bottom left. Lighter areas are going to be much closer to the top right, depending on how bright they are. And the same thing works within the RGB, like individual layers. So what happens is if I pick one of these spots and I click my mouse, you'll see that I get a slider now. And I hold the mouse button in and I can go up and down. And obviously if you go too far, it gets a little out of control. But you can make a lot of really, really powerful changes using curves. Again, you don't want to get too out of control with them because you can see how this starts to get, we get blown out whites and these things aren't looking so great. So you can make a lot of really solid changes with these. And if you want to control specific areas of color inside of your photo, you can go into the red, green, and blue channels. And if you want to do that, I had to pause that for 1 second. So if you want to change the individual channels, you can go to this menu here, select the channel that you want. So there's red, and you can see the changes that I've made here. If I wanted to change those, I can get this little scrubby guy, go in and find the area that I would like. So let's say I want to change the curve here. Click on it, drag up. You can see that it starts to amp up the brightness, the brilliance of all the red in that area. If I drag it down, you can see that it starts to, actually I lost it there. You can see that it starts to drop that down, and so we're getting a lot more leaning into like cyan from that change. And let's go back to this. We can go into the green. You can look at the same type of thing. So if I click here and pull it down, you can see that it's adding quite a bit in the bright areas. You can kind of watch what the curve is doing over on the other screen. So we're dropping these curves down, and it's becoming much more magenta across the board. And let's go to the blue. You drag a specific spot. You can see when I drop this way down that it's becoming much more orange, yellow. In that area, if I drag it up, we get much more into the blues. So they all work like that. It's one of those things that you almost just need to play with quite a bit. There are plenty of tutorials and things you can read as well, but honestly, you can get a feel for it the more you mess around with it. So that's curves. It'll give you some really strong adjustment options and a lot of control that just by playing with those. All right, so that image again, I just wanted to kind of go through those really quickly without you having to follow along. And then we're going to move on to two more images. That these are the ones that you're going to be working on for your actual assignment. So we'll get to those just a second here.